another edition of Bumps and Thumps, the talk of wrestling. I am Brian Ferguson. As you can see to my left and right, I have the world's most dangerous pro wrestling historian, George Schire. And, of course, to my right, your left on the screen, I have one of the great announcers of all time, a man that I grew up watching in the AWA and later on the WWF, Mr. Ken Resnick. And folks, we got a treat for you tonight. We got an announcement to make. George, go ahead.
Thanks, Brian. And we have a big announcement to make. And as you said, Ken Resnick, Killer Ken, as some of the wrestlers referred to him, is here. And the big announcement is, and I just had to get Ken on the show, as longtime old AWA fans know, and some WWF fans know, Ken Resnick was one of the premier announcers back in the 80s into the 90s. And he brought us All-Star Wrestling and the Championship Wrestling from WWF. But the unique part of our visit tonight is that Ken is being honored this July 9th, 10th, and 11th at the George Tragos Thesz Professional Wrestling Hall of Fame in Waterloo, Iowa. And he's being honored with a Gordon Solie Announcers Award. Now, if anybody who has followed wrestling over the last 40, 50 years knows, Gordon Solie was considered and called the dean of professional wrestling announcers throughout the South, Florida, the Mid-Atlantic, and for many years, just the premier voice of so many wrestling programs. And he does have, he's been honored in Waterloo with this great award. And now each year they bring in an honor an announcer that is equally deserving. Now, to introduce Ken very briefly, and I want Ken to tell some stories here then. I was a fan of the AWA from the very early 60s on. I saw them all. I lived through the great, legendary, in my opinion, Marty O'Neill. I lived through the great, legendary, in my opinion, mean Gene Okerlund. And I tell you, and I mean this sincerely, I lived through the era of when Killer Ken, the legendary announcer, took place. And all I'm going to say, and I want Ken, you then to expound on this, we went through a very turbulent time in wrestling about 1993, 84-ish. There was a thing that happened. The WWF at the time had done something that hadn't been explored before. There was an attempt to do a national takeover. And in order to do that, young Vince McMahon Jr. at the time, he needed a poster child for his wrestler. He targeted Hulk Hogan. That was big, big, big in the AWA. Hulkamania started with Verne Gagne. And Vince realized that this was the guy that could possibly be his first ticket. Then he did something which, as a wrestling fan, we noticed important in the business. He took our TV announcer, who was Gene Okerlund. And one Saturday, I'm watching All-Star Wrestling, and Gene was gone, and here was Ken. And at that point in time, we had some questions. We had some concerns. We didn't understand what was going on. It was still a kayfabe era, where we didn't hear from other territories. So, Ken, you came on television, and I just want to know how that all happened for you and how you were approached and what was going on in your head during that time.
Well, the funny thing is, George, I was the sports director, and I was doing the sports on the 6 and 10 o'clock news at the NBC affiliate in Rochester. So I had, television background, on camera, post-production experience. And if you remember back in those days here in the Twin Cities, one of the big highlights of the summer was the Joe Duffy Celebrity Golf and Tennis Tournament. And Jim Lupien, the car dealer, was a good friend of mine. was one of the chairmen. And part of the problem with that, almost any golf tournament, but they would get anywhere from 10,000 to 25,000 fans. And, they were bringing in the elite of the elite celebrities. They had the cast from MASH one year, the cast from Hill Street Blues, then Vice President Gerald Ford. And it's hard for a lot of the fans in attendance to get close, to any of the celebrities. So Jim came up with the idea that they would have this big stage, call it Celebrity Corner, where the celebrities would get interviewed. Sometimes, they would be an MC, ask some questions, but the fans could kind of get to know them. So Jim called and said, I want you to be the host and MC of that, which was great. And amongst those celebrities that came through was Verne Gagne. And, growing up in the Twin Cities, like I had watched All-Star Wrestling. Nowhere near to the degree you did, but, I was a fan and watched it and understood it. So when Verne came up, I was able to do the interview somewhat intelligently, asking about different wrestlers and, the upcoming show. And, it went fine. It was great. We talked maybe 10, 15 minutes, on stage in front of, thousands that were, watching. And then later that night at the party, Verne came up to me and, thanked me for the interview and thought, I did a great job. And he asked a little bit about my background. I told him, wanted to know what I was doing. And, that was it. We had a nice conversation. And then we both went back to partying, if you will. And then about 2 weeks later, I was back in Rochester at the station, and Verne called me. And it was funny, the receptionist, rang my phone. She said, "You're not going to believe it. Verne Gagne's on the phone for you." And he asked if I ever came back to the cities. And I said, I come back every weekend. And he said, how about, why don't you meet me for lunch at Interlochen Country Club? And I'm thinking, is this like a rib? What? But I met him and we talked, and all of a sudden he said, with your background and your public relations and knowledge of television, how would you like to come work for me? Work in the office, work on marketing, a lot of different things. And we'll eventually, work you in and you'll start doing some of the smaller market interviews. I gave notice and came up to the office, and Jack Lanza was working there full time. So I got to be really friends with Jack. We'd go out to lunch almost every day. And they had talked about, I was going to eventually start doing the interviews for some of the smaller markets. And then all of a sudden, Gene told Verne he was done. He was going to New York. So instead of starting with the small markets, I was the guy doing interviews for all the markets. And I'm, doing 6 and 10 o'clock news is very different from doing wrestling interviews and promos. And I'm very grateful that one of the best pieces of advice Jack gave me right before we started, we were doing the interviews then at the old Channel 9 on York Avenue in Edina. Yeah. Jack took me aside and he said, can I give you some advice? And I said, God, absolutely, anything. He said, you know what the best way to get yourself over is? And I said, no, Jack, tell me. He said, don't ever try and get yourself over. And he said, the other thing, forget anybody you've seen do interviews. Don't try and be anybody else. Be yourself. Do it how you would do it, because otherwise the fans will never believe in you. And those were the two things that I always did. And even, years later, when I went to New York, I would start every interview day, in the back of my mind, I would always tell myself, don't ever try and get yourself over. And I think that served me well. And I've heard from a lot of the great talent I worked with back then. I would see them, at conventions and signings. And they were always very welcoming, very glad to see me again. And it was Bret Hart one night. I ran into him. We were doing a show in Charlotte, North Carolina. Was coming upstairs and stopped at the desk. It was about 1 o'clock in the morning. I wanted to get a coffee for the in-room coffee maker. And Bret had just arrived and was checking in. And we sat and talked for about 45 minutes, just the two of us in the lobby. And he was the one that said, I always liked when I worked with you because I knew you were never going to try and show me up or steal the scene. And that's, I approached it. It was my only job was to get as good an interview out of whoever the talent was, be they baby faces or heels. And I think it worked well because, there were other announcers that, sometimes would kind of show them up a little bit because, guys could be great in the ring, but weren't used to or comfortable with doing one-on-one. So I think they were a little more relaxed knowing I was never going to attempt to do that.
Yeah.
It's very interesting the way you describe it because, and I can only say that was the best advice that Lanza could have given you.
Yep.
One of the things that as a wrestling fan in those days, when I saw the transitions of Marty O'Neill to Gene Okerlund and of course to yourself, and in between there at different times, we had Roger Kent that would fill in at different times and do TV, as well as El Darusha did a little bit too. But from an onlooker, one of the things I always understood, I thought, it's always got to be hard to follow someone who has a great following. And I saw that. I'm going to share this with you, that with Gene Okerlund, when he started to transition in and did more and more, and Marty O'Neill eventually was no longer able to do television after he'd been doing it for 30 years. There were so many fans in the beginning, Ken, that who is this Gene guy? Where's Marty? You're trying to replace somebody that's just a common face to you, and he's a friend to you, that weekly high fans, Marty O'Neill, and I've really felt sorry for you because now I'm an adult at this time. And when I saw what was going on with the wrestling world, I really, at the beginning, I felt sorry for you because I felt you were being put into a position where whether you liked Gene Okerlund as a personality on TV as a fan or you didn't, you were replacing Gene Okerlund. And that just can't be easy to do.
No,
And I will tell you, you did a good job of it. And like I say, I think for the very reason you just said, you didn't try to be Gene Okerlund. You certainly didn't try to be any other announcer. You tried to be Ken Resnick, and it worked.
and one of the things that made it a little more difficult, when Gene replaced Marty, was well known. It was because physically Marty just really couldn't do it anymore. So, there was a reason it happened, and I think the fans back then, fully accepted. But because Gene left for New York, and as you said, it was a kayfabe era, nothing was ever said. It was just, all of a sudden Saturday morning, you tuned in to All Star Wrestling and you got me and not Gene, with really no explanation. So that made it a little harder. But I also truly believe one of the things that made it easier was because I had been working, in the office with Jack. Jack and I had become very good friends. We had lunch together 3 to 4 times a week. I think Jack kind of spread the word a little bit amongst the boys that, hey, this guy's okay. You know, he's not a plant, or he's not a tattletale, that, you know, you can trust him.
Right.
So I think that helped the transgression a little bit more, because I think that the talent wanted to work with me, you know, as best they could. And something else that gave me a tremendous advantage, you know, Jack and I would run the small towns around the Midwest for Verne. So we would, you know, drive to the towns a little bit ahead of time. A lot of times Nick might ride with us, Bobby might ride with us, Crusher might ride with us. And so I was able to just listen to them, and they were the ones that instilled knowledge of the business, the psychology, what works, you know, what doesn't work. And you know, the more I learned, it's like the example people say, well, you know, you can maybe help some of the guys, but how do you do that? And like a simple reason is, if you're interviewing a baby face that's maybe not a real good talker and is getting a little flummoxed, you could just say, you know, I know who, insert opponent's name, some of the things he's done, some of the things he said has got you upset, and it's hard, but you've got to focus, because that's his game. He wants you to knock you off your game. And conversely, if you're interviewing a heel that may not be a great talker, you know, it was easy to say, you know, you're saying you're not worried, you're not afraid, but you certainly seem very nervous with this match coming up. So there were little things you could do, you know, along the way. And I think after a while, the talent trusted me enough that if they were on a roll, I wouldn't interrupt. But if they were not doing so well, I would at least interrupt to say something and come back with a question to give them a few seconds to kind of regroup.
And one of the things that you touched on, and I applaud you for this, because you made a point that sometimes it's better to be a listener. You learn more by listening, be a sponge, absorb the business, and then you gain the trust and the confidence. And what a lot of new fans, the modern era, probably doesn't understand is that when the business, back in, as we call it, the kayfabe era, it was such a closed fraternity that the wrestlers, by their own nature, they didn't get close to fans. They would talk to you briefly, but they weren't going to get close and personal with you. They didn't want to come out of character. And like you did, I can only relate that I learned from my own experience as first a fan that I had to learn their confidence, where they would know that I'm not there to spout out to people that, you know, wrestling's fake or it's not real, or try to reveal names and identities and do all this stuff that a smart fan would like to do. I was there to promote them and encourage them. And that's where, like you're saying, I learned that I got their friendship and their trust. When you mention a guy like Nick Bockwinkel, Nick, to this day, I miss his phone calls where we could chat. But I earned his confidence, and with Red Bastien and Greg Gagne and so many others. But I did it because I listened, and I told them I was there to help them. I wanted to promote them. So you learned your lesson.
Well, and I think one of the other things that uh, helped me and the fans, I think of it, took a liking to me. You know, I found out over the years, it going to signings and conventions, of the way they respond, is that I made the decision to play it absolutely straight. No, you know, comedic inserts, that I played it, you know, if I'm interviewing, you know, Nick for a title shot, I played it just like if it was Frazier Ali, that dead serious. This is real. Somebody could get hurt. Talk about the pressure, on the challenger, on the champion, and I think that was a good decision, on my part. And as you know, back in those days, we didn't rehearse anything.
Oh, yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, even my first week, we just did the interviews and, hope they went well. And, even, the time when I was in New York, as big as Hulk was, and, in those days, it was all market specific interviews. So sometimes
Yeah.
we might do, 12 basic, the same interview, but insert the town, the arena, something about the city. But I would always, to everybody, but every time to Hulk, I would always say, have you got anything special? What do you want to do? And he would always say, you just start, I'll follow. Yeah, but we
Right.
didn't rehearse anything.
Yeah.
So it was, there was, I think the passion came out more in the interviews in those days, because, with me, if I wasn't doing it how I would do it, being myself, it wouldn't have been believable to the fans. And the same hung true for the talent. If they weren't doing the interview how they would like to do it, it just wouldn't be believable.
Yeah.
One of the things that we talk about often is that, as a fan my whole life, and I will admit, most people know this, I don't follow the modern day product even a little bit, but I have over the years.
Not alone there.
Well, I have over the years where I know how it's evolved and how it's changed, and how, if you look at today's wrestling versus, let's just say 1980s and before wrestling, it isn't, it's an apples and oranges scenario. But a lot of the fans don't realize that what you just said, Ken, that when you went there on interview day, you knew that you were going to you were doing an interview for a match between Bockwinkel and Mad Dog in Rochester, Minnesota, and they knew the date, the time, and the opponent, and they ran with it for 2 or 3 minutes, and they got their wrap up, and then they go on to the next interview and probably do the same thing for the next town they were going to be in. Whereas today, and God bless them, it works, and I love the fans that are enjoying their product. But today, you have to learn a 10, 12, 20-page dissertate to present to the people and memorize it. And it's different, but it works. It's different generations.
A couple years ago, when she was here, I had the opportunity to meet Trish Stratus.
Yeah.
And I ran into her, and I was just going to say hello. She was at Twin Cities Con, and I was down there, and had my nephew with me. He was a big fan of hers, and I wasn't going to say anything. Just meet her and get a chance for him to get an autograph, and that was it. And when I got close, one of the fans shouted out, "Do you know who that guy is?" Yeah, and she had no idea. I was, before her time. And she asked, and I told her, and she said, "Really?" And I, yes. And I had shown her something. One of the websites had just come out. They did the top 10 forgotten personalities of the WWF in the 80s.
Wow.
And I don't know if to this day, George, you're the historian. I don't know if this was good or bad, but they listed the top 10 and they had me first. I don't know if that was a good thing or a bad thing,
no.
but I showed that to her. And then we were able to spend some time later, and she started watching some of the old interviews. And she said, that's what's missing from today. The
Amen.
passion.
Yeah.
She said, you guys had passion she said, I'm a pretty good talker, but when I do it, I'm so busy trying to remember what I was supposed to memorize and say what they wanted me to say, not what I want to say.
Sure.
And it was, she noticed that right away. And yeah, I mean, just a tremendous individual. What a great talent she was.
Well,
I wanted
and
to-
what you just said is so factual, because on interview day, you, of course, you were there to deliver those lines, as you mentioned, but you knew you didn't have to worry when you had a guy like Ray Stevens or Nick Bockwinkel or Mad Dog Vachon, because you knew that they were going to give you the 2 minutes, whatever they needed to put themselves over, to make the fan want to run to see them get beat or to see them win. And you didn't have to do anything except be that person to feed the line and then encourage the fans to doggone get your tickets, fans, because you don't want to miss this.
One of the things you might not even know, the doing the interviews in the AWA were a lot easier than doing them in the WWF.
Oh, I
From the
know that.
standpoint, in the AWA, it was a soft out because it would be edited. The interviews would go in, and then depending on time needed, they could extend the entrance to a match or they could cut it short. So, if we were going to do a 2-minute interview, if it went 2:10, if it went 1:56, it was not an issue.
Right.
But in WWF, the matches were edited ahead of time, and they would leave a donut for the interviews to be done. So we had each interview was 1 minute and 54 seconds. There was a giant countdown clock right above the camera. And if you went 1:56, you had to do it over. If you got out at 1:52, you had to do it over. It had to be 1:54. So about the only thing I did pre-interview in WWF, I would always ask whoever the talent was, do you want me to pay it off, or will you watch the clock? Do you want to pay it off?
Sure.
And if they would say, I want you to pay it off, I'd say, okay, with about 10, 12 seconds, I'll just give you the little tap on the foot so you stop and let me hit the out. That was really the only thing. Which of the two of us or three of us was going to pay it off?
Sure. Yeah, and from the fans watching, it was very smooth, nice transitions. And, the thing that is important for older fans, we loved those interviews. We have people today, they say, well, Verne Gagne, he only showed squash matches on TV. Well, that wasn't what was advertising the show. It was highlighting the wrestler and wrestlers, tag teams, etc., that were going to be getting the fans to get off their couch and come and buy a ticket. And that's what was important.
I mean, the fans, I think, George and Brian, you'll agree that for TV purposes, the most important talent there was the enhancement talent.
Yeah.
Right.
They had the job of making sure it was a good match and an enjoyable match, but the stars were going over.
Right.
And,
Yeah.
it was interesting. Like when I was in WWF, he was one of the greatest villains, heels of all time, Ted DiBiase. But
oh, yeah.
when Ted was on TV in a, quote unquote kind of squash match, he always wanted to make sure and see to it whenever the time allowed that whoever he was working with had at least one good comeback in the match. That most of the wrestlers back then really appreciated the enhancement talent. And more so, as you say, how important they were in the AWA, because almost every television match was really a non-competitive match, but they had to work with it and make it look like it was a competitive match.
Yeah.
Well, and that's the wrestlers of that era. That's what their job was. They had to make the enhancement talent look a little believable, and the enhancement talent, they had to have some believability to them. The great Kenny J, You know, we knew every match Kenny was on that he was going to run into that boot in the corner ring post and get beat, but he had his moments when he had
Yep.
Nick on the run or the dog on the run or whoever it was for a little bit. But it was those interviews that in those, and Ken, this goes all around the territorial system that was around before the national expansion. I don't know about you. I know that many times over the years in my wrestling fandom, I had the opportunity to go to other territories. And one of the things I always looked at, because I was always interested in broadcasting and I enjoyed what the announcers did. And so I was looking always at the announcers. And when I would be down in Tampa, Florida, and I would see Gordon Solie and hear Gordon Solie, I was in awe at how he handled it, and he had a certain way to do it for his territory, for his fans. When I went to Oklahoma, I remember there was a guy called named Dave. Oh boy, I swear it was Lane. I couldn't believe that he was so different from my Marty O'Neill, etc., and Gene Okerlund. And I didn't think he did that good of a job, but he got over with his fans, with his era. So the announcer had a tough job. And I really, one of the things that I've always admired is that in all essence, you guys were the show. You opened it, you had to have your segments in between, and you closed it. So I mean, you were the bookends for what the fans were going to see. Welcome to All Star Wrestling, and you got some announcements to make, and then you get your interviews. And when you get to the end of the show, you are the last voice they hear, see, and want to again run to buy their tickets.
That was always great, except for the Wrestle Rock Rumble, where the same thing. I had to open it and I had to close it.
Well, you know, and speaking of the Wrestle Rock Rumble, you realize that right now, as we sit here in April 2026, it is now 50 years ago, or 40 years ago. I'm sorry, 40 years ago.
Yeah.
In April of 1986.
This month, 40 years.
This month, yes, yeah, and you know that was a good example of how things had transitioned in wrestling in only a couple of years, because once the national expansion took place, and we, as an AWA person, I saw our talent coming in and going. New talent coming in and going. We saw talent leaving all the other territories. You know, Oklahoma, the Mid-South was being raided. You talk about Ted DiBiase and the Junkyard Dog and the Fabulous Freebirds. These were all guys that were raided from that territory. You talk about the Florida territory and Mid-Atlantic. And so fans all over were seeing, now the big thing was the pay-per-view. And we no longer wanted to go to the matches in the auditorium. We get 6 guys together and watch TV in our living room. It was changing fast.
Well, you know, I was talking to somebody in the business about a week ago. We were talking about a number of things. And I said, if you think about it, Vince McMahon was really ahead of the game. He basically created, you know, the transfer portal with NIL, because he would pay more, and you know, guys would just say, "I'm leaving." You know, he was smart enough, and you know, now look what we have in college athletics. You know, when you hear some guys are staying, you know, for their senior season in college because they'll make more money than if they go pro.
Sure.
Yeah.
Ken, one of the things that I think I'd be remiss in not doing when we have you here, obviously you had the honor to work with, we're going to say, so many legends, from Hulk Hogan right on down. And what I guess I'd like to ask you is, from an announcer standpoint, do you have some that you can say that, man, you loved working with them? And were there some that, you know, did you ever have anybody that intimidated you, or you didn't care to work with them? If you care to share with us.
I'll tell you what, I was really only intimidated with one interview, and it was the first time I did an interview with the Road Warriors, with Paul and Animal and Hawk.
Mm-hmm.
They had just come back from a tour in Japan, got to TV, late in the afternoon. I had never met them. They had never met me. And as soon as they got there, Verne had you got to do this interview, and this interview. We were backed up. So I hadn't even been able to introduce myself to them. And suddenly we're doing an interview for an upcoming match. And here comes Paul, Animal, and Hawk, with the dog collars. They're huge, the spiked shoulder pads. And I was going, probably if I had a chance to spend a minute with them, I would have been a little more relaxed. But, like any fan, you see them coming out of the dressing room for the first time, you're going like, oh boy. And it was funny. And I think Paul Ellering kind of sensed that I was a little intimidated, because when they came out, he went right up to me and he said, "Do you know why God gave you a nose?" And
I
I'm
remember
like,
that interview.
and he goes, "So you can breathe through that and keep your big mouth shut." And then they just went on. But the funny thing was, a couple of years ago, I was hosting a banquet in Charlotte, and Paul was one of those being honored. It was the Road Warriors, but Paul was there because Animal and Hawk are both gone. And I talked about him, introduced them. John Nord came up and he was there and talked a little about him. And then I introduced Paul. Paul came up and I gave them the plaque. And as I'm walking down the steps to let Paul speak, he says to me, "Hey, Ken, do you remember the first words I ever said to you?" And I said, "I absolutely do." And he said, "What were they?" I said, "You asked me if I knew why God gave me a nose." And Paul said, "So you could keep your big mouth shut." But, after the interviews, I got to meet them both, and they were great guys. But that was really the only interview, because I had no idea what to expect. And I think Paul sensed that, but in typical Ellering Road Warrior way, he put me down, but he gave me a life jacket at the same time.
Sure.
I wanted to ask you, Ken,
Yeah.
when the WWF, they called you, contacted you, and asked you to come, how difficult of a decision was that for you to jump from AWA, who gave you your push basically, and go into the WWF? What was your mind going through there?
It wasn't difficult at all, and it's been a bit of a misnomer. Uh, Wrestle Rock was my last day in the AWA. I was done. And before I ever got into television, I was district sales manager for Chrysler Corporation, and I had already called, and there seemed to be a very real opportunity where I was going to go back to work for Chrysler in the corporate world. So
Okay.
I was done. A lot of people keep saying, "Well, they stole you away." No, they really didn't. And what happened, Wrestle Rock was on a Sunday night, and the next night, Jack Lanza called. He had already left. He was an agent, road agent for New York, and he called just to find out what happened, what the finish is, how the crowd reacted. Jack still respected. He wasn't looking for any inside, just wanted to know, because there wasn't any internet in those days yet. So he was just curious. So we talked about the matches and how Waylon Jennings was received and how he performed and what kind of crowd they had. And he said, "Well, anything else happen?" I said, "Well, I quit." And Jack started laughing. He said, "No, really?" I said, "I did. I'm done." And he goes, "You're kidding." And he said, "What are you going to do?" And I told him I was probably going to go back to work for Chrysler. He said, "Don't do anything. I'll be home Wednesday. I'll give you a call. We'll get together." And I said, "No, I'm going to take a couple of weeks off anyways." So he got home Wednesday night and he called me and he said, "Let's have breakfast tomorrow." And I said, "Okay, great." He said, "I'll pick you up at 5:45. And I said, "Jack, I love you. I'm not getting up at 5:30 in the morning to have breakfast with anybody." He said, "I'll pick you up at 5:45 and wear a coat and tie." I said, "You don't think I know a rib? What are you talking about?" He said, "I talked to the office. Vince wants to see you. We're flying to New York in the morning." And I started laughing. I said, "Jack, I know what this is all about. You're not getting up at that. There's none of that. You're just going to look at the clock and think I've been up and I'm waiting for you to pick me up standing outside in a coat and tie." And he said, "You call Northwest Orient Airlines. You ask them if there's not a prepaid ticket for you and me on the 7:40 flight tomorrow to LaGuardia." And sure enough, there was. So I had left the AWA. That, they didn't steal me away. I went out and interviewed. I interviewed with Pat Patterson. I interviewed with George Scott. I interviewed with Arnie Skolin.
Okay.
And then they kind of must have given some positive feedback, because then eventually I got in to meet with Vince.
So, I wanted to ask you too. Go ahead. Finish your sentence.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I was going to add the schedule. Now I've heard, and you can validate this, you were an announcer there, was just like grinding. Like the AWA, it had a easier schedule than the WWF. Is that an accurate statement?
Oh, if anything, you're underselling the difference. That we did interviews in a different city, sometimes like 3-4 days a week, because back then, oftentimes WWF would be running 2 towns a night. Guys who were working 25 to 28 days a week. So the only chance to do current interviews, as we're getting closer and closer to the show and announcing more matches, was to do them on the road at the arenas in the hours before a house show. Wow. So I was, even back then, I was probably gone 20 plus days a month, and it was a different city every day. Friends would say, "God, all that travel must be great." And I would go, "Beats me. All I see is the airport, the hotel, and the arena." And then it's get up in the morning and get on a plane and start all over again. But yeah, it was grinding. And I remember it was common knowledge that Hulk was considering going to the WWF. We always got along great. I mean, he was the one that came up with the nickname Killer Ken, which still sticks today. And I always tell people, I was really the only nickname Hulk ever gave. People think, he gave, Jesse the Body, and that was Gene Okerlund. So I'm really the only, nickname that Hulk has given out. And it was Jesse that started calling Gene Mean Gene before Hulk got there. But I had talked to Hulk and we always got along. And, I said, I mean, the money difference was huge. And I said, what's holding you back? And he said, because Verne can still give me the one thing Vince can't. And I said, what? He went, time off. Because I think when Hulk started, I bet, there were some Sundays where he wrestled twice, that he would be in one town for an afternoon show. And even though it was the main event, he would come on before intermission because they would run him out to the airport, get on a plane, and he would be the main event in some town about 3 hours later. I bet he worked 25 to 28 nights a month.
Wow.
And there were some weeks where literally he worked
Ken,
8
my
times.
friend, I got to tell you, we just got to kind of bring this home. This is so special when we decided we were going to bring you on tonight. And I want to thank you for the fun stories, sharing a little bit about how this all happened to you. But the really big news, and fans, if you've never attended the George Tragos Thesz Professional Wrestling Hall of Fame, located in Waterloo, Iowa. It's also the Dan Gable Museum. And Dan Gable, folks, is the world-renowned greatest amateur wrestler of all time. But on July 9th, 10th, and 11th, it's an outstanding weekend, a Thursday, Friday, Saturday. And it's a quote a great announcer in Marty O'Neill, run, don't walk to get your tickets. But the reason I'm telling you this is because this guy we're looking at right here, who's shared his time with us, Ken Resnick, is being inducted into the Hall of Fame, getting the renowned Gordon Solie Wrestling Announcer Award. And Ken, my friend, it could not happen to a better guy right now. If you ask me who I'd choose, I'd say, let's give it to you. Tell us about what it is when you got the word.
Well, George, first off, coming from you, one of the great AWA and wrestling historians, our friendship aside, that means a lot that you are on board with it. I have to tell you, I was and still am flabbergasted. I literally never thought I would even be on their radar. And it's so special for a number of reasons, not the least of which was how I found out. I was home and my phone happened to be right next to me, and I got a text. And when you get a text, it only shows you on your phone the first line. You have to click on it to see how what else there is. And I looked down at my phone, and it was from Medusa. And I had just seen her. We had been together a couple months before at a show in Charlotte, and it just said, "Hi, it's Medusa." And I thought, oh, she was just letting me know she was thinking about me and how nice. But I clicked on it, and it said, "You have a minute to talk." And I just texted her back, "For you, I've got a whole lot more than a minute." We both kind of came in the AWA around the same time and started in 1983, and have just been wonderful friends. Over the years, we've gone to lunch, we've gone to dinner, we've gone to drinks, we've gone to games. I mean, she's just a very, very special person to me. And whenever we're together, it's like that old friend you haven't talked to for years, and you're together about a minute, and it's like you hadn't talked to them for 2 days. So I texted her that, and she called within like 30 seconds. And I said, "This is such a nice surprise out of the blue. It's so good to talk to you." And she said, "Well, I have some really exciting news, and I'm really not supposed to do it. It's supposed to be official, but I'm on the board of the Tragos Thesz Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame." And I thought she was telling me she'd been, elected to the board. And I said, "That's great. I can't think of anybody better." She said, "No, not that. I've been on the board." She said, "You're going into the Hall of Fame."
Wow.
And the fact that she took the time and wanted to be the one to tell me, and she was so excited for me that I was going into the Hall of Fame, made it that much special. And she was telling me all about it. And I said to her, "Any chance you're going to come?" And she said, "You're going in." She said, "I wouldn't miss it." And she said, "I'm going to bring my husband. I wanted him to meet you. I'm so excited for you." "Yes, I will absolutely be there." And then what made it a little more special, I'm not sure even if George knows this, but Gordon Solie grew up here.
Yes, I did know that.
And we both went to Minneapolis Southwest High School.
Wow.
So I'm guessing Southwest will be the only high school in the land that will ever have two Hall of Fame announcers
Wow. That's awesome.
as attendees.
Yeah.
So going into the Hall of Fame as a Gordon Solie honoree is just more special because we both
Yeah.
went to the same high school. And
Yeah.
I have to tell you, I hope I'm not letting the cat out of the bag or anything, but George, I'm so honored and thrilled that you and Lorraine are going to be there. Wonderful.
We are going to be there, and I want you know this, Ken. I saw that you were going to be getting the award and being inducted, and you know that I gave you a phone call in person. I wasn't going on Facebook and doing an in-personal typing congratulations. To me, it's a big deal
Yeah.
because as a longtime fan, but an AWA fan, I've lived through the Martys and the Genes and the Kens and others. And I will tell you, it means the world to me that you are getting this honor because
Yeah.
I just feel, I told you I always liked announcers. Just
Hmm.
and I never wanted to be one. I will tell you that I never wanted to be a wrestling TV announcer, but I admired them.
Yeah.
And when I got that word, I called you right away and we talked, I think, for an hour and a half.
Yep, and I'm so and it's I am so thrilled by it, but more so how many friends from all over and family that
Yeah.
are coming down
Yeah.
to be there.
Yeah.
It's like well, especially fans here in the Twin Cities. Ed Hellier from Steel Domain is coming, who's a good friend. The Golden Idol, Mark Koval from Columbus is coming back. Darla
You,
Stagg, who everyone knows. Barbara Goodish, Bruiser Brody's
Yeah.
widow, is coming back. In fact, I think they published something, so I'm not speaking out of turn. Um, this year, and I mean, I saw some of the artwork. It's just beautiful. The Hall of Fame ring they're going to give every inductee. Uh, and I got a note, and they published it that Darla Staggs and Barbara Goodish, Bruiser Brody's widow, contacted the Hall of Fame and to sponsor the ring I'll be getting. That they
Wow.
wanted, and I was just dumbfounded. And I called Darla, and she said, I looked at it. The Hall of Fame put that out that people could sponsor your ring and get a private meet and greet, which we don't need because we see you all the time. But she said, I called Barbara. We love you so much that we just wanted to do it. So
Yeah.
that ring is going to be so special. Every time I look at it, I'll be thinking of Darla and Barbara, and
Yeah.
it'll the Gordon Solie honoree that we went to the same high school. So it's like, I'm just still dumbfounded and
Yeah.
fasted and honored beyond anything, I
Yeah.
imagine. And the fact that also comes with George Shire's blessing is pretty special.
I want to
No,
just say
thanks a lot.
I wish I've been there the last 2 years. I've absolutely loved it. Unfortunately, this year, we're full-time RVers, my wife and I, and we are not going to be in that area when that occurs. And I kick myself in the rear end now because I don't know you personally, Ken. This is the first time we've met, but I'm going to tell you, like George said, I had such admiration for you as a teenager, watching the AWA. I grew up in Rice Lake, Wisconsin, so I saw you every week, and I've always wanted to meet you. I mean, we've had the opportunity tonight, but I've always wanted to meet you in person. And unfortunately, I'm not going to be there. And there's other people that are going to be there too. That, of course, George is going to be there all 3 days this year. Of course, last year you came down for a few hours. You know, and then the year I don't come, oh, I'm going to go all 3 days this year. Well, thanks, George. I appreciate
Well,
that.
I tell you what, Brian, if you were inducted into the Hall of Fame, I'd come 3 days too. Um, you know, I do have, I think I mentioned this to Ken when we spoke briefly on the phone for an hour briefly. Um, I am coming down, and of course Lorraine is coming with me, and I'm also excited because my historian friend Tony Richards, and I don't
Yep.
know if you know him, Ken, but Tony Richards is. I'm all about wrestling history. I love it. I live it. I
Hmm.
breathe it every single moment.
Hmm.
And my friend Tony is getting the historian award this year, and so
Yep.
that's another reason that I had to go. And I just said, you know what? I'm going to be down there the 3 days. Plus, I'm going to uh, just be able to see so many friends. You
Yep.
know, I walk in there and Brian, you know this. I walk in there and I know so many people, and I'm so
Yep.
excited to see them all the
Yep.
time. We see each other on Facebook. But Ken, I have to tell you, this is so well reserved or deserved, my friend, and
Yeah.
I am honored that I'm going to be sitting there when you get the acceptance speech. You got some good people behind you with Barbara and Darla. God, I've
Yeah.
known Darla for 45 years,
Yeah.
and she's just a super St. Louis fan, and
Yeah.
we're all going to have a good time. We're going to have some good laughs,
Yeah.
and it'll be fun.
I'm going to see Barbara and Darla in St. Louis in about 3 weeks.
Yep.
Simmons will bring me in for WrestleFest
Yep.
4.
Yeah.
Looking forward to
Yep.
that. And we'd be remiss, especially George, this is such AWA territory, that also in this year's class, gorgeous Jimmy Garvin
Yep.
Hey.
That's right. Yeah.
going in, Jeff Jarrett
Jeff
Yep.
Jarrett.
going in, and Dolph Ziggler is going in, but under his real name because Vince owns the name.
The Ziggler.
So it's a
Yeah.
great class, and
Yeah.
I'm thinking, George, I'm probably going to have to work into my acceptance speech. Acknowledge, of course, always the other honorees, but remind everyone, as you well know, that Jimmy Garvin was the most unduly charged individual in wrestling. Every time we did an interview, whatever the problem was, he always told me it wasn't his fault.
Yeah.
It was a great shtick. It was great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's another
And
person
he's
I've
flipping
always
that
wanted
hair
to.
up. It's not
Yeah.
my fault.
I've
Yeah.
always wanted to meet him too. Always.
Well, now, correct me if I'm wrong, and George, maybe you could chime in here. Brian, if you and your wife are RVers and are going to be, RVing, I think
Yeah.
no matter where you are, there would be a couple of highways that would get you to Waterloo.
I know. You're right. However, we already have a planned route. We're actually we're going instead of Waterloo, which I'm kicking myself in the butt. We're going to CAC this year. We haven't been there for the last 2 years. We've been to Waterloo instead. And since it's the 60th anniversary of CAC, we decided to do that. But then we see all these lists of the who's who, yourself, and Barbara Goodish and Darla Staggs. I just saw them last weekend here in Tampa. There was GrappleCon 4 down here, and they were a part of it. And I was in there, and we're really good friends too. I've known Darla for about 4 or 5 years, and same with Barbara. Just absolutely wonderful people, and I'm so glad that they're going to be there, and I will be there in spirit, Ken. I will be there in spirit.
Are you ever?
Brian, never forget this. You could change your plans. Remember, it says program subject to change.
Yeah.
Oh, I think it was Gene Okerlund that always used to say, fans, whatever plans you've got, change them.
Yeah. We
Yeah.
might have to. We might have to.
In serious note, are you ever anticipating getting up here to the Twin Cities area?
Oh yeah, I'm from Wisconsin originally. My parents still live in Rice Lake. We'll be up there in September, and
Well, why don't you get with George and we'll have lunch?
I'd love to do that, and I will take you up on that.
Brian and I had lunch together with our wives the last
Yep.
time he was up here in the cities.
Yeah.
And Brian and I have had a private visit before that. He had a chance to visit my wrestling museum. So
Yeah.
he's one of the few
Mhm.
that
I am.
get the pass key. But Ken, of course, you're welcome anytime. So
Yeah.
You know, there was a bit of interference, George. I couldn't tell if Brian said, I will take you up on that, or he said, I'll buy. I mean, I'm not sure which.
I probably do
I did.
both.
I thought I heard you say bye. I think, yeah, you did.
Isn't that what it sounded like to you,
Yeah.
George?
I think so.
I would be honored to have lunch with you guys and just talk shop, and yeah, I'd love it. So yeah, definitely when we get closer, I'll contact George and we'll make a day of it, and I'd love to do that. Maybe by pleasure. So
Well,
In the meantime, Ken, bottom line from my heart, you know it, and I know Brian has the same sentiment. We are excited, and I
yes.
am honored I'm honored to be your friend, and I'm going to be excited to see you get what is so richly deserved and earned
Yeah.
through the years with your talent and your charisma and just being around wrestling. To me, I wouldn't miss it.
Yeah.
I'm going to be there, and thank you for coming on Bumps and Thumps with
Yes.
us.
Thank you. Thank you.
And we'll look forward to seeing you in a few months.
my pleasure and my honor, and hopefully, Brian, sincerely, I hope that works out where we can get together in person.
It will, and I thank you for inviting me because, like I said, I've always wanted to meet you in person, and I can tell you're a very personable, nice man. I'm looking forward to it. So, thank you for coming on our show tonight, Ken. Honor and congratulations on your Gordon Solie award and being inducted in George Tragos Thesz Hall of Fame. It's a true honor, and I wish we could be there. Maybe I'll show up. You never know.
You can wear a mask.
Like I said, no matter where you are in this
Yeah.
country, a highway you can jump on that'll get you to Waterloo.
That's
that much
true.
cool. And
Yeah.
I'll tell you what, it's a lot easier to drive there than fly there.
Very true. That is true. That is very true. So, all right, gentlemen, on that note, one more time, the world's most dangerous pro wrestling historian, George Schire, and the 2026 Gordon Solie awardee being inducted in the George Tragos Thesz Hall of Fame, Ken Resnick, an AWA and WWF alum. Thank you so much for coming. I do have one more question. I just popped in my head. Do you have still your AWA jacket or WWF jacket? No.
I don't. And one of my biggest regrets, I never saved anything. I mean, I so many pictures, and
Yeah.
I never had them signed because to me, these weren't superstars. They were my friends and guys I worked with.
Right.
The only and the one thing I'm just and to go back to, we kind of got off topic, George, but you asked who were my favorites to interview and never really answered that. In the AWA, obviously Bobby and Nick,
Yeah.
were right up there, and as was the Crusher. In WWF, Hulk Hogan. Oh, I loved working with George the Animal Steel. I mean, those interviews were, they were comedic, but that was, the character in George's way. And also Roddy Piper.
Yeah.
An interesting side note, and this was really the only talent I worked with that did this. Rowdy would always ask how far in advance of the match the interview was going to air, because the closer we got to the match, as far as when the interview aired, the more psychotic Rowdy would come out. That he was very aware, and his intensity and whatever he was going to do, he would always ramp it up to the culmination of the interview that would air the week of the match. And he was the only one that did that.
Yeah.
So those were, and I had an instant chemistry. They came in about the same time. Always had great interviews with the Rougeau, Jacques and Raymond were another of my favorites in WWF. And of course, Hulk, that almost every interview, he made sure to get in the Killer Ken at least once or twice.
Yeah.
And when I got the news he had passed, it was just crushing. It really was. It was like, even still, you think about it, and he was one of those you think, well, he's going to live forever.
Yeah. 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 So, all right. On that note, we're going to close it out. Thank you again, gentlemen, for coming on. And folks, if you're listening, thank you. If you're watching, thank you. And if you haven't subscribed, please do so. And we will talk to you soon.